It was a perfect spring morning in Mayfield, Arkansas. The air was crisp, the sunlight soft, and the small town was as quiet as ever. Rachel Thompson stepped out of her charming two-bedroom house, her rounded belly leading the way. At 7 months pregnant, her movements were deliberate, but there was a joy in the way she carried herself. Her husband, Ethan, had been away on a business trip for several days, and he was finally coming home that evening. Rachel had planned a surprise, a dinner of his favorite dishes, and she was heading to the corner store to grab a few last-minute items. "You're going to love this," she whispered to her unborn baby, placing a hand on her stomach as she felt a small kick. She smiled to herself as she walked, enjoying the peacefulness of her neighborhood. People waved from porches, and Rachel waved back, her heart full. These short walks were her time to breathe, connect, and look forward to the life she and Ethan were building together. But her serenity evaporated when she reached the intersection at Main Street. A police car came to a sudden stop beside her, with a loud screech, the sound making her flinch. Rachel turned, startled, as the window rolled down to reveal Officer Neil Larson. He was new to Mayfield but already infamous for his abrasive demeanor. His cold blue eyes locked onto her like a predator sizing up prey. "Stop right there," Neil ordered, his voice sharp. Rachel paused, confused. "Excuse me?" Neil swung the car door open and stepped out, towering over her. His presence was intimidating, and Rachel felt her stomach tighten. "I need to see your ID," Neil demanded, his tone curt. Rachel blinked in disbelief. "I'm just walking to the store," she said carefully. "Why do you need my ID?" "You're acting suspicious," Neil snapped. His hand rested on the holster at his side, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Rachel's chest tightened, and her instincts screamed that something was wrong. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she said, trying to stay calm. "Just give me your ID," Neil barked, stepping closer. His voice carried enough force to silence any protest. Reluctantly, Rachel reached into her purse and handed over her ID. Her hands trembled slightly, but she met his gaze with as much steadiness as she could muster. Neil snatched the card, glanced at it, then shoved it back at her. "What are you really doing out here?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. Rachel's fear started to shift into frustration. "I already told you, I'm going to the store," she said firmly. Neil's jaw tightened, his expression growing colder. "Don't talk back to me," he growled, stepping closer until there was barely any space between them. Rachel instinctively took a step back, her heart pounding. But that seemed to provoke him further. "Stop resisting!" Neil suddenly shouted, loud enough to draw the attention of a few passers-by. Rachel raised her hands in surrender, her voice trembling. "I'm not resisting! Please, I'm just—" Her words were cut off as Neil lunged forward, shoving her with enough force to send her stumbling. Rachel's balance faltered, and with her pregnancy weighing her down, she fell hard onto the pavement. "Please, stop!" she cried, clutching her belly as pain radiated through her body. Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at Neil, her fear turning into desperation. Neil's expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed angrier. He stepped forward again and, without hesitation, delivered a hard kick to her stomach. Rachel screamed, the sound piercing and raw. "My baby!" she gasped, her voice breaking as she crumpled to the ground. For a moment there was silence, as if the world itself had stopped. Then chaos erupted. "Call an ambulance!" a woman shouted, rushing toward Rachel. Others followed, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Neil stepped back, his face blank but his voice loud. "Stay back, I'm handling this." But no one listened. The crowd's attention was fixed on Rachel, who lay trembling on the pavement, clutching her belly and whispering over and over, "Please, my baby, please." The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon paramedics were kneeling beside her. Rachel's vision blurred as they lifted her onto a stretcher. Her trembling whispers hung in the air as the ambulance doors slammed shut. As the vehicle sped away, the crowd turned toward Neil. Their faces were filled with anger and disbelief. The trust they'd placed in their protectors had been shattered in a single act of violence. The sterile white walls of Mayfield General Hospital buzzed with urgency. Rachel Thompson was rushed into the emergency room, her face pale and drenched in sweat. The pain in her abdomen was unbearable, and her breaths came in shallow gasps. Please, she whispered weakly as nurses swarmed around her, checking vitals and setting up IVs. My baby, is my baby okay? The lead doctor, a calm but serious woman named Dr. Evelyn Harper, leaned over Rachel. We're going to do everything we can, Rachel, she said firmly. You need to stay as calm as possible. You're in good hands. But calm was impossible. Rachel's mind raced with fear. She gripped the edge of the hospital bed, tears streaking her face as she was wheeled toward the operating room. Meanwhile, Ethan Thompson was in a conference room on the other side of the country when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and saw the name of Rachel's best friend, Natalie. Frowning, he stepped outside to take the call. Natalie, what's going on? The panic in Natalie's voice was immediate. Ethan, you need to get to the hospital. It's Rachel. She's hurt. There was an incident. A police officer. Her words broke off in a sob. Ethan's heart stopped. What do you mean hurt? Is she okay? Is the baby okay? They're in surgery, Natalie said, her voice trembling. She was attacked, Ethan. You need to come home. Now. Ethan didn't wait for details. He grabbed his bag and sprinted to the nearest airport, his mind reeling. Back in Mayfield, the news of the incident spread like wildfire. Videos of Officer Neil Larson's violent attack on Rachel were posted on social media by bystanders. Within hours, the footage went viral, accompanied by hashtags like #JusticeForRachel and #StopPoliceViolence. The small town was in shock. Mayfield had always been a quiet, close-knit community, but now it was thrust into the national spotlight. News vans lined the streets, reporters clamoring for interviews with witnesses. At the police station, Neil Larson sat in the break room, staring at his phone. He scrolled through the comments under the video, thousands of strangers condemning him, demanding justice. His face flushed as he slammed the phone down on the table. Captain Mark Reynolds entered the room, his expression grim. Neil, we've got a problem, he said. This isn't going away. Neil scoffed. I was doing my job. She was acting suspicious. People are blowing this out of proportion. Reynolds sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Suspicious? She's a pregnant woman walking to the store, Neil. There are witnesses, video evidence, and now the feds are calling. You've put us in the middle of a media firestorm. Neil's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. At the hospital, Ethan finally arrived, rushing into the waiting room where Natalie was pacing anxiously. Natalie, Ethan called, and she turned, her face pale and tear-streaked. They're still in surgery, she said, running to him. Ethan, I'm so sorry. I wasn't there. I didn't. Ethan pulled her into a brief hug, his voice tight. It's not your fault. Just tell me she's going to be okay. Natalie shook her head, her lip trembling. I don't know. The doctors said the trauma caused her placenta to detach. They're trying to save the baby. Ethan felt his knees go weak, but he steadied himself. Where's the officer? The one who did this? Natalie hesitated. Still working, I think. People are furious, but the police haven't done anything. Ethan clenched his fists, his body taut with barely restrained rage. That's going to change. Hours passed before Dr. Harper emerged from the operating room. Ethan and Natalie shot to their feet. Mr. Thompson, she began, her face drawn but calm. Rachel is stable, but it was a difficult surgery. We delivered your baby boy early. He's in the NICU. He's small but holding on. Ethan felt a wave of relief mixed with dread. And Rachel? She's recovering, Dr. Harper assured him, but the physical and emotional toll was significant. She'll need time. Ethan nodded, tears filling his eyes as he whispered, Can I see her? When Ethan entered Rachel's room, his heart broke at the sight of her pale, fragile form. She opened her eyes as he approached, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Ethan, she sobbed. I tried to protect him. I tried. Ethan sat beside her, taking her hand. You did everything you could. You're both fighters. But even as he comforted her, his mind burned with anger. He wouldn't let this go. Ethan sat in Rachel's hospital room, her fragile hand resting in his. She had drifted back to sleep, exhausted from surgery, but her face was still etched with pain. The monitors around her beeped softly, and the sterile hospital air was heavy with tension. Ethan's eyes moved to the photo of their newborn son that a nurse had brought in earlier. The tiny baby, hooked up to machines in the NICU, was fighting for his life. Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles whitening. He had seen enough. This wasn't going to end with an apology or a slap on the wrist for Officer Larson. Standing quietly, Ethan slipped out of the room, careful not to wake Rachel. He walked to the hospital's small waiting lounge, where Natalie was still sitting, scrolling through her phone. "Anything new?" Ethan asked, his voice low but steady. Natalie looked up, her face pale. "It's all over the news. People are furious. But the police department hasn't made a statement yet. Larson's still on duty. They're trying to spin it like Rachel was resisting." Ethan's jaw tightened, and a cold resolve settled over him. They're stalling, hoping this blows over, but it won't. Natalie hesitated. "Ethan, what are you going to do?" "Whatever it takes," Ethan replied simply, his tone so calm it sent a chill down Natalie's spine. What Natalie didn't know, what almost no one knew, was that Ethan wasn't just a corporate consultant. His past life was a carefully guarded secret, even from Rachel. Before they met, Ethan had spent over a decade as a CIA operative, specializing in covert operations and intelligence gathering. He had left that life behind when he married Rachel, promising her stability and normalcy. But now someone had threatened his family, and Ethan's old instincts were already kicking in. That night, Ethan returned to their empty house. He walked straight to his home office, opened a locked drawer in his desk, and retrieved a small black case. Inside were tools he hadn't touched in years: a laptop with encrypted software, a satellite phone, and a USB drive containing programs designed to bypass security systems. Sitting down at his desk, Ethan began working methodically. He accessed public records, surveillance footage, and police department files, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Within hours, he had uncovered Neil Larson's personnel file. It didn't take long to find dirt: complaints of excessive force, incidents of racial profiling, allegations that had mysteriously disappeared from his record. Ethan wasn't surprised. He knew how corruption worked in small-town systems like this. He dug deeper, hacking into Larson's private emails and financial records. What he found painted an even darker picture: backdoor payments from local business owners in exchange for looking the other way, an affair with a married co-worker, and evidence that he'd falsified reports to cover up past misconduct. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind calculating his next move. The information was damning, but simply turning it over to the authorities wouldn't be enough. He knew how easily evidence could disappear if it reached the wrong hands. No, he needed to make sure this story couldn't be buried. The next morning, Neil Larson woke to find an envelope on his doorstep. Inside were printed photos of his emails, bank transactions, and compromising messages. A note scrawled in bold letters read, "We know everything. This is only the beginning." Neil stared at the papers, his face pale. His heart pounded as he stepped back into his house, locking the door behind him. He tried to calm himself, but his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Check your email." Neil hesitated before opening his laptop. In his inbox was a link to a video, a carefully edited compilation of every dirty deed he'd ever committed. At the end of the video, a voice spoke. "You hurt the wrong family. Make it right, or the world will know the truth." Neil's blood ran cold. He slammed the laptop shut, sweat dripping down his temple. At the same time, Ethan sat in his car outside a quiet cafe, sipping coffee as he monitored Neil's reaction through a secure feed. He had planted cameras outside Larson's house and tracked his phone. Every move the officer made was under Ethan's watchful eye. For Ethan, this wasn't just about justice, it was about sending a message. Larson needed to understand that his power was an illusion. And if the police department tried to protect him, Ethan would take them down too. As the morning sunlight spilled into the cafe, Ethan's phone buzzed. It was a message from Natalie. "Rachel woke up asking for you." Ethan's expression softened, and he put away his laptop. He would always prioritize Rachel and their son. But in the back of his mind, he knew this was far from over. Larson had one chance to do the right thing, or Ethan would make sure he had no choices left. Neil Larson woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of his alarm piercing through his uneasy sleep. He groggily reached for his phone and froze when he saw another message from the unknown number. "Time is running out. Make it right." His stomach churned as memories of the day before flooded back. The envelope on his doorstep, the video exposing his every dirty secret. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, someone who knew everything. Trying to steady his nerves, Neil pulled on his uniform and headed to work. But the moment he stepped into the station, he knew something was wrong. His fellow officers avoided his gaze. Conversation stopped as he walked by. Even the captain, Mark Reynolds, gave him a look of disdain before disappearing into his office. Neil tried to act normal, but the tension in the air was suffocating. He caught snippets of hushed conversations. The videos are everywhere. People are demanding action. Desperate for answers, Neil approached Reynolds' office and knocked on the door. "Come in," Reynolds said sharply, barely looking up from his desk. Neil stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. "Captain, we need to talk about this situation. The media is blowing everything out of proportion." Reynolds set down his pen and leaned back, his expression cold. "This isn't the media's fault, Larson. It's yours. There's a pregnant woman in the hospital, and the whole country has seen you kick her." "She was resisting," Neil shot back, but his voice faltered. "I was following procedure." "Procedure?" Reynolds cut him off. "You call kicking a pregnant woman procedure? Save it, Neil. The department's reputation is in shambles because of you. Do you know how many calls I've had from reporters, lawyers, even federal investigators? We're hanging by a thread here." Neil's chest tightened. "So what? You're throwing me under the bus?" Reynolds stared him down. "If it means saving this department, then yes. We've got enough on our hands without defending you." Neil left the office, his hands trembling. As he walked back to his desk, his phone buzzed again. "Check your car." His breath caught. He rushed outside, scanning the parking lot nervously. When he reached his car, his heart sank. Someone had plastered flyers on his windshield, copies of the same damning evidence from the envelope. Around him, people on the street were staring, whispering. Neil ripped the flyers off and threw them into the trash, but the damage was done. His carefully constructed image of authority was crumbling, and the weight of it was crushing him. Across town, Ethan sat in his car, parked a block away from the station. His laptop sat open on the passenger seat, displaying live footage from a hidden camera planted near Neil's car. He watched Neil's frantic reaction, his expression unreadable. Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Natalie. "How's Rachel?" he asked, his tone softening. "She's awake, but she's still shaken," Natalie replied. "The doctors say she needs time to heal physically and emotionally." Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I'll be there soon." "You should know," Natalie hesitated. "People are talking about you. They're calling you some kind of hero for exposing Larson." Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm not a hero, Natalie. I'm just doing what needs to be done." After hanging up, Ethan turned his attention back to his laptop. The footage showed Neil pacing near his car, his phone pressed to his ear. Ethan smirked faintly. He already knew who Neil was calling, the department's lawyer, trying to figure out how to cover his tracks. But Neil wouldn't find an easy way out. Ethan had made sure of that. That evening, Neil sat alone in his living room, a glass of whiskey in his shaking hand. The house felt oppressively quiet, the weight of his secrets pressing down on him. The video from the mysterious sender replayed in his mind, the voice that had told him, "Make it right, or the world will know everything." Suddenly, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call. The number was unknown, but he answered anyway, his heart pounding. The screen flickered to life, showing a shadowed figure sitting in an unrecognizable room. A distorted voice spoke. "Your time is up, Neil. Tomorrow you will resign. You will confess to what you've done and apologize to Rachel Thompson publicly. If you don't..." The figure leaned forward and the voice grew colder. "This video, and every dirty thing you've ever done, will go to the press. And trust me, they'll be eager to see it." Neil stared at the screen, his mouth dry. "Who are you? What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. The call ended abruptly, leaving Neil staring at his reflection in the blank screen. For the first time in his career, Neil Larson felt powerless. The next morning, Mayfield buzzed with anticipation. News of Officer Neil Larson's upcoming press conference had spread rapidly, fueled by rumors and whispers. Reporters packed the town square, their cameras and microphones ready. Residents gathered in clusters, their faces a mix of anger, curiosity, and hope. In a small room at the hospital, Rachel sat propped up in bed, Ethan by her side. She looked better than she had the day before, though her movements were slow, and her eyes still carried the weight of what she'd been through. Ethan held her hand, his expression calm but focused. "They're saying he's going to resign," Rachel murmured. Ethan nodded. "He doesn't have a choice." Rachel studied him for a moment. There was something different about her husband, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. "Ethan," she said softly, "did you have something to do with this?" Ethan met her gaze, his expression steady. "He hurt you, Rachel. He hurt our family. I wasn't going to let that go." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she squeezed his hand. "Thank you." At the town square, Neil Larson stepped up to the podium, flanked by police officers who looked as if they'd rather be anywhere else. He was pale, his shoulders slumped, and his usual air of confidence had evaporated. The crowd quieted as he adjusted the microphone, his hands trembling. "I want to address the incident involving Rachel Thompson," he began, his voice shaky. "What I did was wrong. I abused my authority and caused harm to an innocent woman and her unborn child." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Rachel watched from her hospital bed as the live broadcast played on the TV. She gripped Ethan's hand tightly, her heart pounding. "I deeply regret my actions," Neil continued. "I offer my sincerest apologies to Rachel and her family. Effective immediately, I am resigning from the Mayfield Police Department." The words hung in the air as the crowd erupted into a mixture of gasps and applause. Some shouted angrily, others cheered. But one thing was clear: Neil Larson's career was over. As he stepped away from the podium, reporters bombarded him with questions, but Neil didn't answer. He walked quickly back into the station, his face etched with shame. Back at the hospital, Rachel exhaled shakily, her tears flowing freely now. Ethan wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "It's over," he said softly. Rachel nodded, though the weight of the past days still lingered. "What about the others?" she asked, looking up at him. Ethan's jaw tightened. "If there are more like him in that department, they'll be dealt with, one way or another." Rachel didn't ask what he meant. Deep down, she knew Ethan had done something extraordinary, something she might never fully understand. That evening, Ethan returned home for the first time since the incident. The house felt quiet, almost too quiet, but it was a comfort after the chaos of the past few days. He sat in his office, staring at the locked drawer where his tools were hidden. He opened it one last time, pulling out the black case. Inside were the tools that had allowed him to expose Neil Larson, the tools of a life he thought he'd left behind. Ethan stared at them for a long moment before snapping the case shut and locking it away again. As he stood, his phone buzzed with a message from one of his old contacts. "Everything handled. Let us know if you need more." Ethan typed a quick reply. "Thank you, it's done." He set the phone down and walked into the living room, where he stared at a photo of Rachel smiling on the mantel. His expression softened. For Ethan, this wasn't just about vengeance. It was about love, protecting the life they had built and ensuring their son would grow up in a safer, fairer world. He knew there would be challenges ahead. Healing wouldn't happen overnight, and the scars, both physical and emotional, would take time to fade. But as he stood there, Ethan promised himself one thing: no one would ever harm his family again.